Hello, everybody. Welcome to class. Today we're going to talk about feminism. We're going to talk about a critique of a book called Lean In um, and by Linda Burnham titled Lean In and 1% Feminism. Our discussion questions for today. So first I want you to give the impression, give your impression of how Linda Burnham views Sheryl Sandberg's book on feminism compared to how Sheryl Sandberg views her own book. If you were to identify the top three concerns of the average working class woman has regarding gender equality, what would they be? Do you think that Sheryl Sandberg's perspective connects with these concerns? Why or not? So make sure to support your argument. Make an argument that about widespread structural changes such as universal access to health care or childcare, paid paternal leave for both genders, how that would lead to greater gender equality or equity in society. Explain how traditional feminist movement has recognized that achieving having it all requires structural change within society, but how corporate feminism seems to be seen as the for the top 1%. And then explain how trickle-down feminism is related to corporate feminism and trickle-down economics is related to corporate feminism. And why does this overlook the needs of the 99%? I also found a word that I thought you guys should know the definition of, so I want you to make sure that you define and use the term appropriately when you answer this question. Okay, let's talk first about Linda Burnham's view of Sandberg's work. This is a critique, and what she's doing is she's critiquing Sandberg for focusing on individual success and completely disregarding or neglecting systemic change, right? So Sandberg does a good job at saying, oh, well, I understand that not all women want to have a corporate job or that not everybody's, it's within their talent or their scope. And I understand that there are some systemic issues. So she kind of, what Burnham does is she says that Sandberg inoculates herself from criticism in this regard. She's like disregarding the real criticisms that can be made against her by saying, oh yeah, well, I understand those are there, but let's talk about individualism essentially, right? So she emphasizes how Sandberg's work essentially is what she calls a manifesto for corporate feminism. And it's offering advice not for women in general, but for the top 1%, right? So these are not any kind of systemic solutions. There's no macro level critical thinking here involved, right? These are advice for individual high achieving women already who have high socioeconomic status, likely that they are part of the dominant racial group, dominant economic group, right? And this is one of the arguments that was made of the second wave of feminism, which is the what is largely perceived as like a white women's movement, where the white women of the 1960s were fighting for what they said is equality, but they were fighting for the right to move back into or move into the workforce because they were relegated into the domestic sphere, right? The distaff sphere, the feminine side of the women of a relationship. And the critique of that movement as well was that A, it doesn't account for a lot of the structural changes that everybody else faces, and it really had nothing to do with women of color. Women of color had been always and still were at that time within the economic sphere, right? They were still working. Had always been working, right? And they were also raising the children of upper class women in that regard. And so that's kind of what Burnham is saying. She's saying it's not a feminism in general, but it's a particular brand of feminism that is aimed for the elite, most powerful, dominant group of women, right? The top 1% of the high socioeconomic status. In other words, other women like Sandberg who are COOs of Facebook, right? And how they can change or empower themselves. And that's what she's saying. She's saying that, Sandberg is saying she's promoting individual empowerment, what she calls leaning in to corporate success, right? Making the argument or advocating that women should be strong and powerful and speak up and have a voice within the corporations, and that will lead to individual success for women like her, right? And that advocacy only really works for women like Sandberg. And that's the argument that Burnham's making. It's not aimed at women. It's only aimed at women who can afford to take that risk, because that type of advice is irrelevant to most working class women, right? So like what she says, while leaning in at the managers meeting, is going to work for a woman at the top of the corporate jungle gym, it doesn't fundamentally change the exploitive nature of women's work and women's environmental work. And in the beginning of the book, of the article, I think on the first page, right? She's saying to the extent of having it all means having a brilliant, fulfilling, highly compensated career plus a load-bearing partner and happy home life, that conversation is dead on arrival for 99% of women. So what are the concerns of the average working class woman? Well, for most women, having it all is not even an option, right? It's out of reach. Most women are expected to, as she puts it, be driven hard, pay little, burdened by debt, and eventually cast aside, right? So most women know they have to work harder than their male counterparts to just be seen as deserving to be in the same place, never mind being above, right? So they have to go above and beyond to just be perceived as qualified and deserving to have a position, even a lower position. And there's no amount of leaning in that's going to solve the idea of how women have to juggle sometimes multiple low wage jobs, their family, their never ending domestic labor, their never ending childcare expectations. And don't forget, all of those expectations are first for women and expected to be on women, right? So while we are doing that, women are looking at, more of a concern of having economic equality, being paid at a similar rate, affordable childcare, and work-life balance, right? Because the majority of the labor is still expected to and still placed on women. It's the responsibility of women first, and it's the responsibility of women last as well, right? So they're doing most of the childcare. If your child gets sick, you're the one that's going as a woman to have to leave your job to go pick up your child. And women still do, on average, 60% or more of domestic labor and childcare. While men are doing more than their fathers did, they're still doing less than their current wives do, right? So women are still struggling with that balancing act of caregiving and work responsibilities. And sometimes that caregiving isn't just their children or small children. We often think of that. It's also aging parents as well. So just to put it in perspective, let's talk about economic equality, right? We've all heard like women make 80 cents on the dollar. And that does change depending on your race and the socioeconomic status that your parents have. But to put it a little bit differently, it takes a woman a college degree to earn what a man makes with a high school diploma. So that should put it into perspective for you, the level of additional labor that women have to go to just achieve the recognition that they deserve to have an equal chance in the economic playing field. It is most domestic labor, most childcare is women's responsibility by default. So both before and after women have children, and even if they don't have children, the assumption is they might have children and therefore are less deserving or less of a valuable choice for leadership roles, right? On top of that, all of that additional labor that women are often doing in terms of family, domestic labor, and children is presumed to be worthless work. It's not valued, especially things like care work are not valued. That's when you are expected to not just cook and clean, but care work is to manage your feelings while you manage someone else's feelings, right? So if someone in your house, like a child or a spouse, throws a fit, it's your job to help them regulate their emotions while also controlling your emotions. And that is expected of women to do, not just for their children, but say, for example, for their alcoholic spouse as well. So what Birmingham is doing is she's trying to make a case for structural change, right? So the macro level change as opposed to just individual change, right? She says the feminist movement's recognition, the overall modern feminist movement, has a recognition that structural supports like childcare and paid leave are essential for gender equality. So what does that mean? It's not just about individual choice. It is going to take systemic structural changes, changes in law, changes in policy, and changes in the way in which our economic, family, education system are structurally changed in order to be able to create more of a level playing field. Things like universal access to childcare and paid leave significantly help reduce the burden on women and give more of an equal playing field. We know in countries like in the Netherlands, right, where they have more access, universal access to childcare, and they have more of an equal paid leave for both fathers and mothers. It's generally a year. You can split it any way you want, right? Not only does that change the ability of both men and women to grow in their careers, it actually changes significantly the level of value that both parents, fathers and mothers, put on caregiving for their children. And so they actually receive the benefit of more equal distribution of household chores, domestic labor, child care labor as well. So what happens is that doing more of what is considered to be corporate feminism, right? So this is this kind of elite idea of individual advancement, right? Completely neglects those structural changes that are needed and neglects all the needs of lower income women. And we mean lower income women by anybody not making the type of wage that a COO would make, right, of Facebook. So we're even talking middle class women and upper middle class women as well. It eliminates or neglects their needs as well, because those women are also still, as they're leaning in and trying to have it all, still burdened with the majority of domestic labor, right? So while this like individual empowerment idea works great for women with really high socioeconomic statuses and benefits them in their advancement, it actually does it to the detriment of every other woman, right? And it doesn't address the systemic barriers that most women are facing, right? And Sandberg says that, or Sandberg says that an inability to address these issues shows the limits of her approach and her insight into the problem. right? Having it all is an illusion that leaning in will not make it real, right? So the idea that you can essentially have a high paying career, have a family, have children, have a healthy family life, right? And a spouse who will leave you the additional burden of the domestic labor and still be content and fulfilled and happy, dismisses the real inequality and the structural barriers. So, what's the difference between what we call traditional feminism and corporate feminism? Traditional feminism seeks to change the structural inequality, right? Seeks structural change, while corporate feminism focuses on individual success within the corporate frameworks. This is, oftentimes, if you think about basic sociology, right? This is the conflict perspective, the dominant group versus the subordinate group, and a functionalist perspective, right, where it's all about the individual. And Sandberg's feminism aligns with that individual empowerment perspective, but it completely ignores the collective action for systemic change. The problem with that is that a lot of that is very similar to these notions of what we call trickle down economics, right? She's calling it out as a trickle down feminism. The assumption that elevating women at the top is going to somehow benefit all women, right? So in the Reagan administration, trickle down economics was this idea that if you raise the income of the people at the very top, it will act as like a mountain of rocks, and that money will spill down and make everybody wealthier. But what we have experienced is that it's not a mountain of rocks where the wealth like water would trickle down. It's more of a mountain of sponges where the ones at the top have soaked up the majority of the wealth, because now we're currently at like a 90-10% disbursement of inequality, right? So the top 10% hold 90% of the wealth, and the rest of us, including people you think are rich, are holding about 10% of the wealth, right? Almost none once we get down to the middle class and the poor. The middle class are barely indistinguishable from the poor in terms of holding wealth, right? And so we know this is a lie. We've seen it as it's played out in trickle down economics. So building up just the very wealthiest, most powerful women, having them have more equality and success does not at all equate to equality and success for women of color, women who are working class, women who are immigrants, women with disabilities. It doesn't equate to that at all. And it's not going to trickle down to them. It's just going to be absorbed at that very top 1%. And that's what Burnham's doing. She's critiquing Sandberg for this very kind of classist approach to feminism, because her focus on policy changes even are ones that only benefit women like her, women in high corporate positions, not women who are working class, not women, not the average woman, not the typical woman, right? And so what that would mean is that this idea of trickle down feminism, it would depend on the benevolence and the gender politics of those at the very top. And we've seen in our culture how that plays out. That is not going to equate to greater equality for everybody. So, if you've ever taken a sociology of social problems, this should start to sound familiar to you, because this argument that's being made, that's being pointed out, the critique that's being pointed out, is that books like Lean In miss the mark, because they focus on individual empowerment, right? Instead of structural change. It's the micro versus macro in social problems, we call it system blame versus individual blame, right? So, we don't like the word blame, right? But you can think of it as a system perspective versus an individual perspective. And in our culture in America, especially if you're uneducated, we are, or if you have like just a high school education, you're only taught to see things from a micro level perspective. So it's all about individual choice, individual talent, individual success, right? And what is invisible to a lot of people are the structural inequalities that make it very possible for people at the very top who don't have talent, who aren't intelligent, who don't have a good work ethic to still rise higher and rise to the top. But people who are even talented, successful, hardworking, intelligent, who are poor or working class, the systemic barriers are such that the chances are you're never going to get up to a higher class. It's easier to fall down the class ladder from generation to the next, especially if you're middle class or working class, than it is to go up. It's next to impossible. We like to put to the front people who have gone up that social ladder, but it's quite rare. Um, and so when we frame the issues like this, right, it's easy to do what we call individual blame, right? So it's not the fault of the system or the systemic barriers or the system inequality. It's the fault of the individual. And so therefore we can maintain the status quo and we don't have to make any changes to the system that is already oppressing groups based on race or class or able-bodiedness or sex, right? So we don't have to do that. So a couple examples of how we've done this in our culture. We make this argument all the time, right? Multi-generational poverty. We will say it's the fault of the poor for clinging to the culture of poverty argument, right? So it is because of poor people's choices, and that's why they stay poor, right? And so that's what their fathers didn't teach them how to be rich or how to, play the game appropriately. And so they don't buy the right things. They don't do the right thing. They don't go to the right schools, right? They don't address at all the systemic inequality that maintains poverty over generations. Instead, we get to blame it on individuals. It's a nice scapegoat. Another way we do it is ongoing racial discrimination. So we'll say it's the fault of Black individuals who are too focused on the past and playing the race games, right? If you combine those two, you have like the Moynihan report where they say it's Black families' fault. It's the fault of Black individuals and families because they are, they aren't able to move up the social ladder because they are culturally. The Moynihan report basically argued that, because Black moms were too strong and Black fathers were absent, and that's why Black families can't make it out of the poverty cycle, and that's why children, Black men end up in jail and that kind of thing. We completely ignore the several hundred years where Black people as a whole were enslaved, and all of their labor went to people in the dominant group, in this case, white people. And then even when they were no longer enslaved, they were no longer allowed access to living wage jobs. They were not allowed the same access to education, literally by law, right? The structural inequality was that Black people couldn't get a higher education, whereas white men could. So then once that we have emerged into like what we say modern times, right? The modern era. We pretend like that didn't exist, like all that systemic inequality didn't exist, and it's somehow now the fault of Black families or Black women for being strong and going to work and working hard and raising their kids on their own when their husbands or or the fathers end up being discriminated against and pulled into the policing system and into the prison industrial complex, right? And so it allows us to just completely ignore the systemic inequalities and completely blame individuals. And it's easy to do that when our education system is set up in such a way that we don't understand or see how macro level systemic inequality or systemic changes can affect us as individuals. It allows for people at the very top to create those systemic barriers and for other people to be able to just accept that or even vote in against their own interests because they don't understand how those systemic issues or systemic barriers can impact their everyday individual lives. And we're doing this again here with gender inequality, right? So gender inequality is an individual problem. The way that she's putting it out in this book, it's the fault of individual women for not focusing on individual empowerment, for not leaning in, for not working hard enough at their job, for not choosing better, higher paid jobs, right? We've heard these arguments. It is not about a systemic inequality between all men and all women. The argument that she's actually buying into while she's advocating for this type of supposed feminism is that it's still other women's fault. It's, the fault of women of color for not being as successful as she is. Okay, well, we have our discussion questions. I hope you enjoyed the lecture for today, and you have a wonderful day.